I caught our HOA president sneaking around my garage at 6 a.m. 3 days later, her $80,000 Mercedes was crushed into a metal cube while she was on vacation. Was I responsible? Absolutely. Was it legal? 100%. Here's how it happened. What's up, everyone? This story comes from the NuclearRevenge subreddit, where someone shared how they got back at their power-hungry HOA president in the most devastating way possible. If you've ever dealt with an unreasonable HOA or someone who abuses their tiny bit of power, you're going to love this. Grab something to drink, get comfortable, and let's get into this wild story of trespassing, revenge, and sweet, sweet justice. I never wanted to live in an HOA neighborhood. The idea of paying someone to tell me what I can and can't do with my own property seemed ridiculous. But when my wife and I found our dream home in Pinecrest Estates 3 years ago, we decided the beautiful house and neighborhood were worth putting up with some rules. For the first year, everything was fine. We followed the guidelines, kept our lawn maintained, and generally flew under the radar. The HOA fees were reasonable, about $125 a month, which covered the community pool, gym, and maintenance of common areas. I actually started thinking that maybe HOAs weren't so bad after all. Then everything changed when Barbara Thompson was elected as HOA president. Barbara was in her mid-50s, with that perfectly styled blonde bob haircut that screams, "I want to speak to your manager." She drove a shiny white Mercedes GLE coupe that probably cost more than what most people in our neighborhood made in a year. Her husband was some kind of executive who traveled constantly, leaving Barbara with nothing but time on her hands and a desperate need to feel important. From day one of her presidency, Barbara made it clear that she intended to clean up our neighborhood. Suddenly, violation notices started appearing on doors for the most minor infractions. Your garbage can visible from the street 6 hours after trash pickup? That's a $50 fine. Christmas lights still up on January 2nd? $75 fine. Grass half an inch too tall? Another fine. My first run-in with Barbara happened when I parked my work truck in my driveway overnight. I'm a contractor, and occasionally I need to bring my truck home to load materials for early morning jobs. According to Barbara, this violated the No Commercial Vehicles clause in the HOA covenant. I tried explaining that it was temporary, but she wasn't having it. "Rules are rules," she said with that smug smile while writing up a $100 violation. "If we make exceptions for one person, soon the whole neighborhood will look like a construction site." I paid the fine and made arrangements to park my truck at a buddy's place when needed. It was annoying, but not worth fighting over. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of my problems with Barbara. Over the next 6 months, I received violation notices for a basketball hoop in my driveway, not permitted. The color of my garden hose, apparently green, was not aesthetically pleasing. A single weed that had sprouted between the cracks in my driveway. Having friends over who parked on the street, limited to 2 hours. A bird feeder that was attracting nuisance wildlife. Each violation came with a fine, and Barbara seemed to take special pleasure in delivering them personally. While other board members would simply leave notices in mailboxes, Barbara would ring doorbells and hand them over with that same smug smile. It felt targeted, but I couldn't prove anything. My wife suggested selling and moving, but the housing market had dipped, and we would have lost money. Plus, this was our dream home, and I refused to be driven out by someone on a power trip. So, I did what any reasonable person would do. I became obsessive about following every single HOA rule to the letter. I printed out the entire 87-page HOA covenant and studied it like it was the Bible. I measured my grass with a ruler twice a week. I pressure-washed my driveway monthly. I even painted my mailbox the exact shade of agreeable beige that was specified in the guidelines. For 3 months, I gave Barbara absolutely nothing to complain about, and it drove her crazy. I could see it in her eyes when she walked past my house during her daily inspections. She would slow down, squinting at my property, desperate to find something, anything that violated the rules. But there was nothing. My compliance was absolute and infuriating to her. Then came what I call the garden gnome incident. The HOA rules stated, and I quote, "No lawn ornaments or decorations shall be visible from the street or neighboring properties. With the exception of seasonal decorations, limited to 30 days of display. Nothing in there specifically banned garden gnomes in backyard areas not visible from the street. So, I bought one. A single, innocent garden gnome that I placed in my fenced backyard near my vegetable garden. Unless you were standing on a ladder looking over my fence, you couldn't see it. It was my small act of rebellion, a reminder that not everything in my life was under Barbara's control. Somehow, Barbara found out about the gnome. To this day, I don't know how. Maybe she was peering over fences. Maybe a neighbor told her. Regardless, she showed up at my door one Saturday morning with a violation notice for an unauthorized lawn ornament. "This is in my backyard," I said, trying to remain calm. "It's not visible from the street or any neighboring property, unless someone is deliberately looking over my fence, which would actually be trespassing." "Our rules clearly state no lawn ornaments," Barbara insisted, "except the rules specify visible from the street or neighboring properties. This isn't visible unless someone is trespassing on my property to look for it." Barbara's face reddened. The board can interpret the rules they wrote however they want," I interrupted. "But they can't penalize me for following the rules as written. If you want to ban all lawn ornaments regardless of visibility, you need to amend the covenant and have it properly voted on by all homeowners." I could see the fury in her eyes. Barbara wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who knew the rules better than she did. She snatched the violation notice back. "This isn't over," she said before storming off. And it wasn't. Not by a long shot. The next week, I received notices for 5 different violations, all of them fabricated. According to Barbara, my trash cans were visible. They weren't. My garden beds exceeded the maximum allowed height by 2 inches. They didn't. My house trim needed painting. It had been painted 3 months earlier, and more. I contested each violation, providing dated photographs as evidence. The other board members, who had started to grow tired of Barbara's overzealousness, sided with me, and the violations were dismissed. This only made Barbara more determined. Neighbors started warning me that Barbara was talking about me at community events, calling me a troublemaker and a threat to property values. Some said they had seen her walking around my property when I wasn't home, taking pictures and making notes. I installed security cameras, not just for Barbara, but because it seemed like a good idea anyway. 4 cameras covering every approach to my house, with motion alerts sent directly to my phone. I didn't tell anyone about them. I just waited. It didn't take long. 3 days after installing the cameras, at precisely 6:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, I received a motion alert from my garage camera. I was already awake getting ready for work, so I checked it immediately. There was Barbara, in her designer workout clothes, creeping around my garage, which I had left open accidentally the night before. She was taking photos of everything. My tool bench, some building materials I had stored there, even the inside of my refrigerator where I kept cold drinks. Then, she did something that made my blood boil. She opened my work truck, which was parked in the garage, and started rummaging through the glove compartment. This wasn't just HOA business anymore. This was trespassing and attempted theft or vandalism. I saved the footage and called the police immediately. They said they would send someone over, but since there wasn't an active break-in, it might take a while. While waiting, I walked down to Barbara's house. I could see her in her front yard, watering her immaculate flower beds, as if she hadn't just been trespassing on my property. "Good morning, Barbara," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She jumped slightly but quickly recovered. "Good morning. I was wondering what you were doing in my garage at 6:17 this morning." The watering can in her hand tilted, spilling water onto her expensive running shoes. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I have you on camera, Barbara. In my garage, going through my truck. The police are on their way." Her face went through a series of expressions: shock, fear, and then, oddly, a smirk. "It's not illegal for the HOA president to inspect properties for violations." "In garages? Going through private vehicles? At 6 a.m. without notice or permission? I'm pretty sure that's the definition of illegal." "You're overreacting," she said, setting down her watering can. I saw your garage door open and was simply making sure nothing had been stolen. I was doing you a favor. By going through my glove compartment? Save it for the police. As if on cue, a police cruiser pulled up in front of my house down the street. Barbara's smirk vanished. "This is ridiculous," she hissed. "You have no idea who you're messing with." I just smiled and walked back to my house to meet the officer. Officer Rodriguez was professional and thorough. He viewed the security footage, took my statement, and agreed that Barbara had clearly trespassed and potentially committed other crimes by going through my vehicle. However, he also explained that since nothing appeared to be stolen or damaged, the most likely outcome would be a warning. "If you want to press charges, you can," he said. "But without proof of theft or damage, it might just be a lot of hassle for a misdemeanor trespassing charge." I was disappointed but understood. What if this isn't the first time she's done this? What if she comes back? "Document everything," he advised. "If there's a pattern of behavior, that changes things. And you might consider getting a restraining order." Officer Rodriguez drove over to Barbara's house to issue the warning while I left for work. By the time I returned that evening, the neighborhood grapevine was buzzing with news of Barbara's police visit. Several neighbors came by to express support and share their own Barbara horror stories. One neighbor, Tom, revealed something particularly interesting. "You know she doesn't actually own that fancy Mercedes, right?" he said while we stood in my driveway. "It's leased through her husband's company. He's the only authorized driver on the insurance." "How do you know that?" I asked. Tom shifted uncomfortably. "I work for the leasing company. I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but after what she did to your property values claim last month, I figured you should know." The property values claim was Barbara's most recent attack. She had circulated a report to the HOA board claiming that my continued violations were affecting neighboring property values. The report was complete fiction. Property values in our area had actually increased, but it had caused me considerable stress. "Is there anything else I should know about Barbara?" I asked. Tom glanced around to make sure no one else was listening. "Just that the Mercedes is due back next month. Her husband's company is downsizing, and they're cutting back on executive perks. She's been begging him to buy it outright, but from what I've heard, they can't afford it." This was interesting information, but I wasn't sure how it helped me. I thanked Tom and went inside to review my security footage again. That's when I noticed something I had missed earlier. While Barbara was in my garage, she had dropped something near my workbench. Zooming in, I could see it was a key, probably her house key that had fallen off her keyring. I checked my garage, and sure enough, there it was, partially hidden under a stack of lumber. I picked it up, intending to return it. I'm not a monster. But then a thought occurred to me. If Barbara had a spare key to her house, I could simply mail this one back to her anonymously. And if she had dropped her key in my garage while trespassing, was I really obligated to return it immediately? I decided to hold on to it for a day or two while figuring out what to do about the ongoing Barbara situation. Little did I know, this key would become central to what happened next. The following day, I received an email from Barbara. Not a personal email, but a neighborhood-wide announcement. "Attention all Pinecrest Estates residents. It has come to the board's attention that security incidents in our community are on the rise. A male resident, name withheld for privacy, has been documented acting aggressively toward board members and making false accusations to law enforcement. The board is considering implementing additional security measures, which may result in a temporary increase in HOA fees. An emergency meeting will be held next Tuesday to discuss." This was a blatant attempt to turn the neighborhood against me and distract from her own actions. I was furious but determined not to react publicly. Instead, I forwarded the email to my lawyer friend, who confirmed it was potentially defamatory. "You could sue," he said, "but HOA disputes are messy and expensive. My advice? Find a way to get her removed as president. Check your bylaws for recall procedures." I spent that evening reviewing our HOA bylaws, which stated that a board member could be removed with a 2/3 vote from homeowners if they were found to have violated the law or the HOA covenant itself. Barbara had definitely trespassed, which was against the law, and I had proof. The next morning, I woke up to another motion alert from my security system. This time, it wasn't Barbara but a tow truck in front of my house. The driver was preparing to hook up my work truck, which I had parked in my driveway the night before. I ran outside in my pajamas. "What are you doing?" The driver, a bored-looking guy in his 20s, barely glanced at me. "Got a call to remove an unauthorized commercial vehicle. HOA orders." "I live here. This is my truck, and there's no violation." He shrugged and handed me a paper. "Take it up with them. I'm just doing my job." The paper was a towing authorization signed by Barbara, citing the commercial vehicle clause. But here's the thing. After our previous dispute, I had actually gotten written permission from the HOA board, excluding Barbara, to park my truck in the driveway overnight when needed, as long as it wasn't for more than 2 consecutive nights. I ran back inside and grabbed the permission document, along with my proof of residence. By the time I returned, the tow truck driver had already hooked up my truck. "Look," I said, showing him the papers. "I have permission from the HOA board. This towing order is invalid." He looked at my documentation and sighed. "Man, I hate HOA disputes." He pulled out his phone and called his dispatcher, explaining the situation. After a brief conversation, he began unhooking my truck. "Sorry about that," he said. "Not the first time we've had problems with this HOA. Between you and me, your president calls us at least twice a week trying to tow someone." As he was leaving, I had an idea. "Hey, quick question. How does someone get a car legally towed around here? Not for an HOA violation, but like, if someone abandons a car on private property." "Depends," he said. "If it's on your property without permission, you can have it towed as abandoned. You just need to show proof it's your property and sign some paperwork saying the vehicle doesn't belong there. Why? Someone dump a car on your lawn." "Not yet," I said. "Just curious." He gave me a knowing look. "Whatever you're planning, just make sure you're on the right side of the law. Towing disputes can get ugly." After he left, I called in sick to work. I had planning to do. That afternoon, I printed out copies of my security footage showing Barbara trespassing, along with a detailed account of her harassment. I went door to door, showing neighbors the evidence and explaining the situation. Many were sympathetic, having faced Barbara's wrath themselves. By evening, I had collected signatures from over half the neighborhood, supporting a special meeting to remove Barbara from the board. When I returned home, I found my garage door wide open again. This time, I knew I had closed it. My security camera had been disabled, the wire cleanly cut. Inside, my truck's tires had been slashed. There was no proof it was Barbara, but the timing was suspicious. I called the police again, and the same officer responded. "You're having a rough week," Officer Rodriguez said as he examined the damage. "It's not coincidental," I replied, showing him the cut camera wire. He nodded thoughtfully. "This escalates things. Vandalism is a more serious charge than trespassing." "Any idea how they got in?" I hadn't thought about that. My garage door opener was in my truck, which had been locked. The side door to the garage had a deadbolt. Unless... The garage door keypad, I realized. They must have watched me enter the code at some point. Officer Rodriguez recommended changing all my codes and locks, which I did immediately after he left. I also installed new, better hidden security cameras and motion sensor lights around my property. That night, I could hardly sleep. The situation with Barbara had escalated beyond HOA pettiness into something genuinely concerning. What would she do next? And how could I protect myself and my property? The answer came to me around 3 a.m., and it involved Barbara's Mercedes and the key she had dropped in my garage. The next morning, I did some research on Barbara's schedule. Through neighborhood gossip and social media, I learned that she and her husband were leaving for a 2-week Caribbean cruise in 3 days. They would be driving to the cruise port in Florida, about 6 hours away, leaving their house empty. I also confirmed with Tom from the leasing company that the Mercedes was indeed solely registered to Barbara's husband's company, with him as the only authorized driver. Barbara drove it regularly, but technically she wasn't supposed to. My plan was taking shape, but I needed one more piece of information. I called a lawyer friend, not the same one I had consulted earlier, and posed a hypothetical question about abandoned vehicles and property rights. Hypothetically, I said, if someone trespasses on my property, drops something that belongs to them, and then damages my property, do I have any legal claim to the item they dropped? After a long pause, he said, "That's oddly specific. But generally speaking, finding an item doesn't grant you ownership rights. You're usually obligated to make reasonable efforts to return it." "What about abandonment laws?" I asked. "That's different. In this state, if personal property is left on your private property without permission, it can be considered abandoned after a certain period, especially if the owner doesn't claim it after notification. But there's a process to follow." "And what if the abandoned item is a vehicle?" Another long pause. "Are you planning something illegal?" "Because I should warn you." No, I assured him. "Just trying to understand my rights in this ongoing HOA dispute." He didn't sound convinced but explained the process for legally declaring a vehicle abandoned on private property and having it removed. The key points were: the vehicle must be on your private property without permission. You must make reasonable attempts to notify the owner. After a specific waiting period, which varied by municipality, you could have it towed. I thanked him and hung up, my plan now fully formed in my mind. It was risky, potentially crossing ethical lines, but after months of harassment and recent vandalism, I was past caring. The day before Barbara was set to leave for her cruise, I put my plan into motion. First, I checked all my new security cameras to ensure they were working properly. Then, I prepared a legal-looking notice that stated, "Notice of Abandoned Property." A key was found on the premises of my address on date of Barbara's trespassing. "If this property belongs to you, please contact my phone number within 30 days to arrange retrieval. After this period, the property will be considered legally abandoned and disposed of accordingly." I mailed this notice to Barbara's house via certified mail, ensuring there would be a record of delivery. I also prepared a second notice specifically about abandoned vehicles, but didn't send it yet. The following day, Barbara and her husband left for their cruise. I confirmed their departure by noticing their second car, a modest Subaru, parked at a neighbor's house. Apparently they had arranged for the neighbor to watch their house and occasionally drive the Subaru to maintain the battery. That night, I waited until 2 a.m., when the neighborhood was quiet and dark. I took Barbara's key, which I had confirmed was indeed for her house by secretly trying it in her side door lock earlier in the week. I wore gloves, a hat, and nondescript clothing, careful to avoid any cameras Barbara might have installed. Using the key, I entered her garage through the side door. As expected, the Mercedes was there, gleaming in the darkness. I didn't touch anything in the house. My goal wasn't theft or vandalism. Instead, I used the spare key fob for the Mercedes, which was hanging on a hook in the garage, to unlock the car. I drove the Mercedes into my garage, closed the door, and breathed a sigh of relief. Phase 1 complete. The next morning, I placed the second notice on my own front door. Notice of Abandoned Vehicle, a white Mercedes GLE Coupe, license plate Barbara's plate number, has been found abandoned on this private property. The registered owner must contact my phone number within 72 hours to arrange removal, or the vehicle will be towed at owner's expense in accordance with state abandonment law, relevant statute. I took photos of the notice on my door and the Mercedes in my garage, careful to document everything. Then, I called the same towing company that Barbara had tried to use on my truck. "I have an abandoned vehicle on my property that needs removal," I told the dispatcher. "Address and vehicle details?" she asked. I provided my address and described the Mercedes, explaining that it had appeared in my garage without my permission and that I had posted the required abandonment notice. I didn't mention that I knew whose car it was. "We'll send someone within the hour," she said. "Please have your property deed or lease agreement ready, along with ID." When the tow truck arrived, it was the same driver who had almost towed my work truck. He recognized me immediately and gave me a suspicious look. "This the HOA Revenge you were planning?" he asked, eyeing the Mercedes. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said innocently. "This vehicle appeared in my garage without my permission. I've posted the required notice and waited the required time. I want it removed." He didn't look convinced, but checked my documentation. Property deed, ID, and the abandonment notice. Everything was in order legally, even if the circumstances were suspicious. "Where are we taking it?" he asked. "Wherever you normally take abandoned vehicles," I replied. "I just want it off my property." He made a call to his dispatcher, had a hushed conversation, then turned to me. "Normally, we'd take it to our impound lot, but with a vehicle this valuable, we're required to notify the police." This was a potential complication I had anticipated. "That's fine," I said. "I've documented everything according to the law. If the owner wants to claim it, they can deal with your company or the authorities." The driver shrugged and began hooking up the Mercedes. As he worked, he said casually, "You know, once we take this, it enters the abandoned vehicle process. Owner has a limited time to claim it and pay the fees before it goes to auction or scrap." "I'm aware," I said. "That's their problem, not mine." An hour later, the Mercedes was gone, taken to the towing company's impound lot. I had signed all the necessary paperwork declaring it abandoned on my property and disclaiming any ownership interest. Legally, I had done everything by the book, even if the circumstances were ethically questionable. Now, I just had to wait. Barbara and her husband were on a cruise ship somewhere in the Caribbean with limited internet access. The towing company would attempt to notify the registered owner, Barbara's husband's company, but since they were downsizing and potentially ending his employment, it wasn't clear if those notifications would reach him in time. 3 days passed. I received a call from the towing company confirming they had been unable to reach the registered owner of the Mercedes. As per state law, they had also notified the police about the abandoned luxury vehicle. "Just so you know," the dispatcher told me, "if no one claims it within 30 days, it goes to auction. If it doesn't sell, it goes to scrap." "I understand," I said. "Please keep me updated." A week into Barbara's cruise, I got a frantic call from her neighbor who was watching her house. "Someone broke into Barbara's garage," she exclaimed. "Her Mercedes is gone." I feigned shock and concern. "That's terrible. Did you call the police?" "Yes, they've taken a report. I've been trying to reach Barbara, but the cruise line said they're in an area with poor connectivity. They'll pass on the message, but it might take days." "Well, I hope they find whoever took it," I said, trying to sound sincere. Another week passed. Barbara and her husband returned from their cruise to find their Mercedes missing and a police investigation underway. I watched from my window as they arrived home in a taxi, looking tanned but increasingly distressed as the neighbor explained the situation. Later that evening, there was a pounding on my door. Barbara stood there, face contorted with rage. "Where is my car?" she demanded. "Excuse me?" I said, genuinely confused by her direct accusation. "My Mercedes!" "The police say there's no evidence of forced entry to my garage, and you're the only one with a problem with me." I maintained my composure. "Barbara, I have no idea what you're talking about. Why would I steal your car?" "Because you're trying to get back at me for doing my job as HOA president. First the false trespassing accusation, now this." I smiled calmly. "If you're referring to when you broke into my garage and went through my truck, there was nothing false about it. I have it on video. As for your car, I suggest you check with your insurance company or the police." She jabbed a finger at my chest. "This isn't over. When they find my car, and they will, I'll make sure you go to prison for this." After she stormed off, I calmly closed my door and checked my phone. I had received an email from the towing company. RE, abandoned vehicle notice, proceeding to next stage. According to the email, since no one had claimed the Mercedes and paid the accumulating storage fees, they were proceeding with the abandonment process. In less than 2 weeks, the vehicle would legally be considered abandoned and sent to auction. I didn't respond to the email. There was nothing more for me to do but wait. The following days were tense. Barbara's husband filed an insurance claim for the stolen Mercedes, but the insurance company was dragging their feet because the vehicle was registered to his company, not him personally, and he hadn't reported it missing for 2 weeks. The police investigation stalled due to lack of evidence. No fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, no witnesses. Barbara stepped up her harassment campaign against me, sending daily violation notices for imaginary infractions, and organizing an emergency HOA meeting to discuss criminal elements in the neighborhood. But her credibility was waning. Too many neighbors had seen my evidence of her trespassing, and her obsession with targeting me was becoming obvious to everyone. Exactly 30 days after the Mercedes was towed, I received another email from the towing company. Abandoned vehicle. Final notice before auction salvage. The email explained that since no one had claimed the vehicle, it would be sent to a public auction in 3 days. If it didn't sell, unlikely for a luxury vehicle, but possible given its complicated registration status, it would be sold for scrap. I forwarded this email anonymously to Barbara's husband's company, addressed to their general info address. I had no way of knowing if they received it or acted on it. The day of the auction arrived. I took the day off work and attended, keeping a low profile at the back of the crowd. The Mercedes was lot number 17, described as 2023 Mercedes GLE Coupe. White, excellent condition. Abandoned vehicle, title status, pending. The bidding started at $10,000, absurdly low for a vehicle worth over $80,000. But potential buyers were wary. Abandoned luxury vehicles often came with complicated legal issues, and the title status pending warning scared off many bidders. The bidding stalled at $12,500. The auctioneer called for final bids 3 times, and then, to my shock, declared, "No sale!" proceeding to salvage. I couldn't believe it. A perfectly good Mercedes, headed for the scrapyard because of title complications and buyer hesitation. It seemed wasteful, almost tragic. But I reminded myself of the months of harassment, the vandalism, the trespassing, and my slashed truck tires. 3 days later, I received a final email from the towing company. Abandoned vehicle, salvage completed. Attached was a photo of the Mercedes, crushed into a metal cube, along with a receipt showing the scrap value, $1,273.44. The email asked if I wanted this amount sent to me as the reporting party, minus their fees. I replied that they should donate it to the local animal shelter. That same day, Barbara's husband discovered that his company had received my anonymous email, but had ignored it, assuming it was spam. The insurance investigation was also complete, and their claim had been denied due to unauthorized use. Barbara had been driving a company car she wasn't insured to drive. The financial hit was devastating. They had lost an $80,000 vehicle with no insurance payout, and Barbara's husband's company was now investigating him for allowing his wife to drive a company car against policy. Within a month, a for sale sign appeared in front of Barbara's house. The neighbors whispered that they were downsizing due to financial difficulties. Barbara resigned as HOA president, citing personal reasons. Before they moved out, I received a certified letter from a lawyer representing Barbara and her husband. It detailed their suspicions about my involvement in the disappearance of their Mercedes, but acknowledged they had no proof. The letter demanded I disclose any information I had about the vehicle. I responded with my own letter, drafted by my lawyer friend, stating simply, "I have no knowledge of how your client's vehicle disappeared. Perhaps they should check local impound lots for abandoned vehicles." The day Barbara and her husband moved out, I sat on my front porch, drinking a beer and watching the moving truck. Barbara noticed me and walked over, her face a mask of defeated anger. "I know it was you," she said quietly. "I don't know how, but I know you did it." I took a sip of my beer. "You know, Barbara, there's an important lesson here about respecting other people's property. When you trespass, sometimes you lose things. Keys, cars, homes, reputations." Her eyes widened at the mention of keys, but she said nothing. "I hope you find happiness in your new neighborhood," I continued. "Maybe don't join the HOA board there." She turned and walked away without another word. As for me, I was elected HOA president the following month. My first act was to propose amendments to the covenant, prohibiting board members from entering private property without written permission, requiring documentation for all violation notices, and establishing an appeals process for disputes. The amendments passed unanimously. Sometimes at night, I still think about that Mercedes, crushed into a metal cube in some scrapyard. $80,000 of luxury, destroyed because of one person's pettiness and another's revenge. Was it worth it? I'm not sure. But every time I park my work truck in my driveway without fear of fines or towing, I think maybe it was. Oh, and that garden gnome? He's still in my backyard, but now he has friends. An entire gnome village that's clearly visible from my back fence. No one seems to mind. So there you have it. One of the most calculated, perfectly legal acts of revenge I've ever come across. This person managed to turn Barbara's own power play against her by using the very rules and legal loopholes she loved to exploit. They didn't break any laws, but they completely destroyed her financially and forced her out of the neighborhood. I guess the moral of the story is, if you're going to be a power-hungry HOA president who trespasses on people's property, make sure you don't drop your keys while you're at it. Hit subscribe if you want more wild HOA revenge stories like this one.